Good evening, everyone. Thank you, and thank you for saying good evening back. I always think that's awkward when people say good evening and nobody says anything. First, I just want to thank everybody for coming. It means a lot to me that you all are here. I think there's some people out in the foyer, so I hope they can hear me too, because this is for them as well. So I titled this speech 40 because 40 has some significance. So what some of you may not know is that I am one of 3 children born to Earl and Linda Ford. They're both moving, by the way, to Louisiana, so they're not here tonight. But both of my siblings died prematurely. One died as an infant, and then one died at the age of 42. That means I'm the only one left. For whatever reason, though, that didn't quite dawn on me until this year. Another thing that dawned on me is that folks who are dedicated to my line of work, and I don't mean lawyers in general, but civil rights lawyers and activists, they haven't always survived the rigors of the job. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, some of the more historic figures, they all died before the age of 40. A lesser known figure named Alberta Odell Jones was the first Black woman to be appointed city attorney in Louisville, Kentucky. She died at 34. The destinies of these individuals were interrupted not only by hatred, but by fear. Fear that Black people would one day have the same access to the freedoms and privileges offered to white Americans. What would make one man afraid of another man's equality? Nothing, unless the man who is of a higher status is only there because he put another man beneath him. To work without compensation or low compensation, to have to beg for food or steal it so he can feed his family. I believe there was also a fear that if we, as Americans, gave one group equal access to all America has to offer, then we would have to give it to all the other groups. So you see, I personally believe that Black people are the soul of our nation. We helped build this country with our blood, sweat, and tears, and we fought for equality. And when we did fight for equality, we didn't just do it for ourselves. We often did it for other groups as well. That was who we were during the civil rights age. Then we transitioned to this age called affirmative action. That's when I was born, in the 80s and then in the 90s, and the message kind of evolved. We weren't like marching and all of that, but we had the right to vote, sure. We had attained middle class status, but for some of us. But our urban communities were riddled by the criminalization of basic offenses like jaywalking or smoking marijuana or riding through private property on a bike or a skateboard or stealing a 10-cent candy out of a neighborhood corner store. These same offenses, when committed by a kid in Iowa, carried very minor penalties. That's if the police were even caught. Because you see, for kids in Iowa, even when they are the perpetrator of a minor crime, their victims often look the other way because after all, they are just kids. But when a kid from Compton or Pomona or Oakland, that's for my West Coast people, or Chicago or Southeast DC commits any of the minor crimes that I mentioned, jail is the only option, no matter how young they are. They are not seen as kids. They are seen as criminals. And once they get a criminal record, the door to every future opportunity is either closed or it's too difficult to access. So in the 80s, when I was born, we saw a different type of civil rights activism, and I won't call it activism, I'll call it awareness, and it was misunderstood by prior generations. It came about in the form of music. This music would give the world an eye into the reality of where I'm from in Washington. So they refer to urban kids as city kids. Washington State, not Washington, D.C., for those of you who don't know. The lyrics were catchy, but often hard to listen to because of the visceral reality of living in the U.S. as a poor Black youth. That's difficult to digest when you really listen to some of the lyrics. Songs of turning to illegal activities so you can eat, watching drug addiction ravage through neighborhoods, which back then, being an addict was a crime back then. But now in 2020, because of opioids and like my whole state and Oregon and Idaho and all those states are ravaged by opioids, now it's a public health crisis. But back then, it was a crime. The activists of the 80s would rap about their experiences and their pain. That was the era I came up in. Matter of fact, a rapper named Ice Cube would be the first artist to pen a song about police brutality, long before George Floyd, and the countless other names that we actually hear about now. Make no mistake, police killing Blacks had always happened, but technology has only exposed the frequency of that, and every time we see it, it's like this wound gets reinfected, and it opens each time our eyes behold another life lost at the hands of our law enforcement. Or each time a tape recorder catches a conversation between police officers talking about how they want to start a race war, like the officers in Wilmington, North Carolina, who were recently fired for this conversation. But there's a hundreds-year-long history of ruthless violence against Black men particularly at the hands of law enforcement. And I don't have enough time to go into the Ku Klux Klan Act and all of that. But in the 80s, Ice Cube wrote this. And I won't use the profanity because after all, Christians are in the room. But he said this: F the police coming straight from the underground. A young man got it bad because I'm brown. And not the other color, some people think. They have the authority to kill a minority. Cube's song went on to discuss how the police's perception of young Black men like himself from Compton were, that they were all gangbangers or drug dealers, and this bred hostility and fear between urban communities and the police. This song was released back in 1988. Then a more prolific rapper came along. He rose to a height of fame that I don't think any other rapper to date has ever accomplished. Even the White House knew who he was. And they were literally putting this rapper's name out in the airwaves. They considered him a threat. I don't know why, but they did. His name was Tupac Amaru Shakur. A little known fact that is relevant to my speech tonight and my life in this current season is this. Tupac, in 1991, filed a civil rights lawsuit against the city of Oakland and two police officers who blocked his entrance into a bank and requested his ID. Literally, they did this. And when he shows them his ID, they begin mocking his name, Tupac Amaru Shakur. Now, why did they stop him again, you might be asking? Well, he had jaywalked across a street called Broadway, this is in Oakland, to go to Union Bank to cash his check. You see, at that time, he was rapping with a group called Digital Underground. You remember the Humpty Dance. So Tupac explained all of this to the officers. Then he asked for his citation for jaywalking so he could get on with his business. One of the officers then grabbed him by his neck, put him in a chokehold, and threw him down on the sidewalk. The second officer held him down while the other slammed his face repeatedly into the pavement and then choked him until he lost consciousness. As he faded out, the police sat on him, mocking his funny-sounding name, mocking his inability to breathe. One officer then said that he was going to learn his place while he was in Oakland. Now, after all of that, just by a show of hands, do any of you remember the crime that he allegedly committed? Just by a show of hands. Only a few people. Good. That jaywalking? Okay. Does any of that sound commiserate with a jaywalking offense? These types of experiences happen to Black and brown people, male, female, no matter your socioeconomic background. Yesterday, I publicly announced a lawsuit that I filed against the officer who shot and killed Deon Kay, right here in our city. Deon had just turned 18 when he was killed on September 2nd, 2020. He was troubled. Deon was in and out of group homes as a young boy. But at this point, he was at home with his mom, Natasha Kay, and his 6 siblings, as young as 9 years old, and he was assisting her with virtual learning for the youngest children in the home. This has been a horrific journey for Miss K and her children. I cannot describe to you the pain buried in this mother's soul because she will never see, touch, or hear her son Dion ever again. Her tears are soul-crushing to me, but her tears are my ammunition. You see, when I took this case on, I was reluctant, and I had certainly gone to colleagues who said, Yaida, you're crazy. The media coverage was horrible. The chief of police, Peter Newsham, he was the chief at that time, he called Dion a validated gang member. And videos were posted, very unsavory videos on YouTube of Dion's friends and rap music videos where Dion was seen with a group of young men holding weapons. It was awful. This was before I knew anything about him, his background, or his family. But something told me to reach out to Dion's mother. I had this nagging feeling that something was not right with that camera footage, that there was an angle to this story that was unknown. I soon found out that my suspicions were correct. In fact, Dion was not a gang member. The chief of police went on local news and made that statement to cast Dion in a dark light so that the protesters would look foolish or at least quiet down because after all, the kid was nothing but trouble anyway. But I learned that that was simply not true. Then I asked a really smart video forensic analyst to slow down the camera footage of the officer shooting Dion, and he did. I reviewed 50 frames, dozens upon dozens of times. And then I had a second person analyze the same video. And then he pointed out something I overlooked: shadows. There was one frame out of all of these frames with nothing in it except shadow. It was Dion with his hands raised in the air before the officer fired a shot. The DC auditor then released a report last month calling Officer Alexander Alvarez reckless. The auditor said Dion's death was avoidable. But then the auditor opined that Alvarez's killing of Dion was justified. After all, how would the officer know it was a split-second decision and all these things that we hear? But I knew that these inconsistent statements would not only create confusion in the minds of the public, but that these words would ring hollow in Natasha K's ears. I filed suit about a week after this report was released. And when I tried to serve Officer Alvarez, he sent me on a wild goose chase. Because you know, in law, civilly, you have to put papers in somebody's hand for the judge to press go. But I'm happy to announce that we got him over the 4th of July holiday. He didn't see me coming. Right before the 4th of July, I was in San Jose, California, and I was running up and down hills thinking about why I would actually go after this guy. Why do I put myself through the stress of this work? The countless hours spent fighting the government, who has all of the resources in the world to defend an officer when they're accused of killing somebody unlawfully. Then the fear that the police would retaliate against me like they did to Kathy Reynolds, my colleague in Roanoke, Virginia, a few months ago. She won an acquittal of a black man, and then the police got a bogus warrant and raided her house, where she lives with her husband and her son. All she was doing was defending the constitutional rights of her client. That's what I do every day, but on the inverse. I sue officers for violating the constitutional rights of our citizens. And in their eyes, I am now an enemy of the police. I am now a hater of the men and women in blue. I am a target. But the truth is, I only sue the bad cops. I don't sue the many, many good ones who get up every day and risk their lives to protect us. And even suing the bad ones. When I do that, I am upholding our right to be free from unlawful use of force, even if we jaywalked or stole a 10-cent candy. I was praying about Dion's case because even in the first week, as soon as I filed it, the Attorney General and the police were giving me the blues about serving him because, you can serve him electronically. If the officer says he'll accept it, but no officer in his right mind is going to say that. It was the dumbest rule ever. So I practically had people rappelling from the man's apartment building, peeping into his bedroom window. But I really felt the Lord saying to me, act like this was your son. You see, as an advocate, my job is to put myself in the shoes of the person I represent. In this case, it's Dion's mom, Natasha. I agreed to do all the things that I know she cannot do on her own to bring justice for her son's death. And after 3 weeks, I was like, are you kidding me? The countless emails, the phone calls, the letters, just to see if this officer would accept papers. But that's water under the bridge. I got him. So he knew I was looking for him, and I can only imagine the look on his face on July 3rd, 2021, when my processor replaced that summons and complaint in his hand as he was on his way to work. But I have to admit, even with all of that and with all the boldness, I have some fears. I don't take the same route to work anymore. I've moved to a new office in an obscure location, and I'm afraid to update my office address on my website and on social media. I know I'm a target now. Most of my civil rights colleagues who do what I do are male. They live in the South, and they have weapons. I do not. Is it worth it? The toil, the tears, the fear of not knowing whether after all of the time and the resources and the energy spent fighting tooth and nail, not knowing that victory will greet me with a kiss on my forehead, not knowing whether joy will wipe my brow at the end and hand me a Gatorade and say, hey, you did it. The fear of not knowing whether the Lord will say to his handmaiden, well done, my good and faithful servant in whom I am well pleased. I just choose to believe more in my calling than in my fears. I choose to believe that my work will make a difference no matter how small. There is a reason that out of 3 children born to 2 poor, Black children of illiterate sharecroppers, I am the only one to survive. Out of the legendary, risky Black civil rights leaders who put it all on the line during a time when taking on these issues would not yield you a multi-million-dollar settlement, when fighting would not land you a slot on CNN. I am one of the few to not